To our speakers and those who've joined us, welcome to the support seminar on social policy responses to COVID-19. My name is Baba Tamara Kubule, and I'll be chairing the session today. In terms of the program for this session, we have three speakers who will be introduced by Nikki. We've got three speakers, as I said: Jayati, Ghosh, Ruth, Castel-Branco, Kate Phillip, who'll talk to the theme for today, their experiences and social responses, policy responses in different regions. In terms of housekeeping, we'll have the three presentations, and following all three presentations, we'll open up for questions. We'll take a round of questions from the Q&A box. Please feel free to use it. And then we'll open up for live questions from the floor. Please raise your hand and we'll unmute you, and then you're welcome to pose your question. So let's get started. Nikki, please may you start with your introductions.
Thanks, Baba. Afternoon, everyone. My name is Nikki Catania. I'm one of the course directors of APHORD, and I'd like to introduce the speakers very briefly. Ruth Castel-Branco is Research Manager for the Future of Work project at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University. She has a BA in Geography and African Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Development Studies from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and she's currently finalizing her PhD at Wits University. Previously, Ruth worked at the International Labour Office in Mozambique on social and maternity protection. She is an alumnus of the International Centre for Development and Decent Work, and her research interests include informal worker organising and workers' rights, redistributive policies and social protection, agrarian transformation, and the changing nature of work. Welcome, Ruth. It's good to have you. Kate Phillip is author of Markets on the Margin, Mine Workers, Enterprise Development and Job Creation. She's a development strategist with over 25 years experience in policy development and implementation. She's currently supporting the Project Management Office in the Presidency in relation to the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative and the design of an economic stimulus in response to the COVID crisis. She was also involved in spearheading the proposal for a special COVID grant that was approved for people not covered by other forms of social protection, excuse me, as part of South Africa's crisis response. She has a strong background in the design of public employment programs. Through the ILO, she also supported the government of Greece in the design and delivery of their public employment program at the height of the Greek crisis. From TIPS, she led a strategy process on inequality and economic marginalization commissioned by the South African Presidency. And thirdly, I'd like to welcome Jayati Ghosh back to APHORD once again. Jayati is Professor of Economics at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at JNU in New Delhi. From January 2021, she will join the University of Massachusetts at Amherst as professor. She was educated at Delhi University, JNU, and Cambridge, where she obtained her PhD in 1983. Since 2002, she's been the Executive Secretary of International Development Economics Associates, IDEAS, which is an international network of heterodox development economists. She has received numerous awards for her research, including from the ILO and UN. Her current research interests include globalization, international trade and finance, employment patterns in developing countries, macro policy, gender and development, and implications of recent growth in China and India. She has authored or edited 18 books and nearly 200 scholarly articles. She's consulted for a large number of international organizations and is closely involved in working with progressive organizations and social movements. Welcome back, Jayati. Thanks, Baba. back to you.
We don't have much time and we've got a lot to get through. So Ruth, may I ask that you start us off? You're welcome to load your presentation.
Thanks so much, Baba, and to Nikki for the introductions. So today I will be looking at the social policy responses to the COVID pandemic through the lens of the PAJD PE in Mozambique. The PAJD PE is an emergency cash transfer program that was originally created last year in response to the cyclone Idai and Kenneth, and that has functioned essentially as an anchor for the expansion of cash transfers in response to the COVID pandemic. I'm going to provide a quick overview of the work and social security context in Mozambique, and then move on to talk specifically about the PAJD PE before just raising some kind of general concluding thoughts on the importance of going beyond magic bullets, which is a warning that Prof. Jayati Ghosh gave us many years ago through a critique of a series of books that had come out on cash transfers and that I think continues to be relevant today. So this is just a quick overview of what we call in Mozambique the labor process, the distribution of Mozambique's economically active population. And what I just want to highlight is that the vast majority of Mozambicans are classified either as own account workers or household workers without remuneration. Now we know that in reality, folks are cobbling together a livelihood from a multiplicity of activities, paid and unpaid, formal and informal, on and off the farm. But the key issue that I wanted to highlight here is that only 12% of Mozambique's economically active population are salaried workers. And of course, this is sharply gendered. So you'll see that, for instance, if you look at public enterprise, only 25% of workers in those sectors are women. The same for private enterprise. Public administration is a little bit better, but women are essentially concentrated in the lower rungs of the labor market as own account workers without employees, engaged in small-scale agriculture or petty trading or domestic work. So Mozambique has a social security system that is structured around two pillars. The first is mandatory social insurance, which is for workers primarily, though not exclusively, in the formal economy. So about 40,000 of the 700,000 workers enrolled in mandatory social insurance schemes are informal workers, the majority of whom are in the city of Maputo. And then the second pillar is publicly funded social welfare for poor and vulnerable households. Now, given the extent of poverty in Mozambique, estimates of the poverty rate post-financial crisis put it as high as 64.8%. You would think that this was actually the largest pillar of the social security system, the publicly funded social welfare, but in fact it's not. Only 600,000 households are covered by publicly funded social welfare schemes, the majority of those households being single person elderly households. And the reason for this is that although social protection, social security has become a right in Mozambique, according to the social security law, the state really scrambles together a social welfare system that's based on multiple layers of selection, and at each layer, individuals are rendered ineligible. So for instance, an elderly person who is poor is ineligible for a cash transfer if they live in a household that has at least one able-bodied person of working age. And so through these various forms of testing, categorical, household, and means testing, the number of eligible people is whittled down. And that's what strategy that was used, the pragmatic strategy that was used to reduce the number of eligible, quote unquote, beneficiaries in the context of limited, inadequate, in fact, budget allocations to the social welfare sector. Now, I just wanted to highlight quickly the evolution of the social welfare system in Mozambique. So you see that the first cash transfers were introduced in 1990. And they were really to grease the wheels of structural adjustment, to move away from universal forms of social provisioning, such as the subsidized food rationing system, that were ingrained in a socialist vision of social transformation, and to move into these highly targeted residual forms of cash transfers. And so that's when this was introduced. And of course, there's significant debate about whether cash transfers are an extension to or a resistance to neoliberalism. And I think the history of Mozambique specifically illustrates that it is an extension of this process. But of course, you know, folks have also used the case of South Africa to say, well, no, it also represents a resistance. Look how much of the national budget goes towards social grants in the South African context. In Mozambique, that is still less than 2%. Despite the gradual increase in cash transfers. I want to just highlight a couple important dates in this trajectory. The first one is 1996, when you see a major drop in the number of beneficiaries. And this is because this whole increase from 1990 to 96 happened without any increase or investment in administrative structures. And at the time, that was lauded as a great accomplishment in terms of cost efficiency. But actually what was happening was that the few social welfare staff were filling the roles with phantom beneficiaries. So when you then had a re-registration process, you see the number of cash transferred recipients dropped. But I think it's a cautionary tale as we look for easy solutions that sidestep the real hard work of building a state administration that is well-resourced, including in terms of human resources, to be able to administer cash transfers. The other date, of course, I want to highlight is 2007, when international development agencies embraced the idea of cash transfers as an effective and efficient instrument of inclusive growth. And you've seen the gradual increase in cash transfer provisioning since. So Mozambique has 5 programs under the social welfare system. The biggest one is the Basic Social Subsidy Program, or what we call the PSSB, which offers unconditional cash transfers to labor-constrained households. And because cash transfers are administered at the household level, then this program provides different levels of different amounts of the value of the subsidy depending on the size of the household. The second program, which is supposed to be complementary to this one, is the PASH, the Productive Social Action Program, which provides cash transfers to non-labor constrained households. That is, households that have at least one able-bodied person of working age. And those transfers have historically been seasonal and are supposed to be temporary, though they haven't necessarily been, and conditional on participation in labor-intensive public works. The PASH is really a remnant of the old food for work programs. And though multiple evaluations have suggested that it should be eliminated altogether, there's a sort of ideological attachment to them within the Mozambican government, which reflects this sort of ambivalence still in relation to cash versus food. And then you have institutionalized care. So the PASH emergency, which is the program that I'll be discussing today, as you see, projects that it will extend to 990,000 households. So that's almost double what the largest program, the PSSB, is. So this is a significant intervention if it actually is implemented. So the Mozambican government adopted a dual strategy in response to the COVID pandemic with both donors' financial support, but also technical assistance. So the first was to extend cash transfers to current cash transfer recipients. So people that were already registered in the system and could be easily paid out. Though as I'll discuss later, actually payments have been extremely delayed. The second was the introduction of this emergency cash transfer, the PASH-PE, for those who are not currently covered by Mozambique's social security system or social welfare system. So it provides a transfer of 1,500 meticais, which is equivalent to about $21 US, over a period of 6 months to over 1 million poor households, of which 990,000 are new. Because remember, there's still other households that are in this program from last year in response to the cyclone. The focus has been on urban and peri-urban areas, which are projected to be the areas most affected by social distancing measures. The assumption being that small-scale farmers are able to continue their activities as planned, and were not necessarily as affected because the social distancing measures came in place right at the time of harvest. However, we've also seen that there's been a reduction in remittances as migrant workers have returned from South Africa to Mozambique. And of course, because people in rural areas also cobble together a livelihood from other types of activities, those have also reduced. And this has been compounded by a drought in southern Mozambique. So there's all sorts of assumptions that are made in policymaking in Mozambique that essentialize in many ways the peasantry and then prevent social policy measures from being rolled out in rural areas. One of the interesting things is that the Mozambican government opted to include the province of Cabo Delgado, which is a province currently under insurgency. And I think this reflects a growing recognition among the state that social protection can be a tool of governance in the context of growing political unrest. Of course, like the other cash transfers, it then introduced a series of other categories to identify who are the deserving poor, right? The legitimate benefactors of such a grant. So households headed by children and the elderly, people with disabilities and chronic diseases, pregnant women with a high number of dependents. These are categories that have been ingrained. There's sort of a social consensus that these are vulnerable groups. And reflect an accumulated history, I suppose, of social protection over the last 30 years. The cash transfers for now are being financed by the Multi-Donor Trust Fund for Social Protection, which is currently being chaired by the World Bank. And they've put forward half of the resources. And the question is then how will the other half be mobilized? The three sort of key innovations of this program. I mean, the first is that this is the first unconditional cash transfer for able-bodied adults of working age. And that represents an important paradigm shift within the administration of social assistance, social welfare in Mozambique. There's always been this idea that those who can work should not get something for nothing. And so this is an important test of that. And the fact that this program, the sheer scale of this program means that it'll be interesting to see what happens, right? It's also required increased collaboration between different agencies, between the Social Insurance Agency and the Social Welfare Agency that have historically been under different ministries, that receive different pots of money from donors, that sort of follow different logics. And so this is an important step in terms of having greater articulation and perhaps moving towards universality in the future. And I can talk about that in the Q&A. It's also, they've relied significantly on membership-based organizations and to register new recipients. And what's interesting is that membership-based organizations are now saying, hang on, we still haven't gotten paid out, and they're starting to do more newspaper articles and so on. So whereas social protection until recently was something discussed behind closed doors between donors, the state, and sort of your platform for social protection, civil society platform for social protection, you're now having many more membership-based organizations contesting this space. The other big change is that although Mozambique has played around with the idea of outsourcing cash transfer payments, until now, cash transfers are paid manually and by government staff. However, this program foresees that cash transfers will be paid via e-wallet under the guise of transparency and efficiency. So where are we now? Well, it's taken the state 5 months to roll out the program, and no one has yet to be paid, in part because of the jostling between international development agencies and the state. And I just put here an article that's from the Domestic Workers Union saying the unfortunate regime for domestic workers. I think given widespread poverty and the complexity of these targeting or selection approaches, local leaders have had discretionary power. And you're now hearing increasing reports of that reflecting the kind of politics at the local level. The reliance on service providers has also been extremely problematic. On one hand, only 25% of the population have cell phones. So the whole rollout of this cash transfer program has required that the government actually provide beneficiaries with cell phones. But the digital divide is not just based on the lack of a cell phone. It's about lack of literacy, lack of access to network, electricity, the ability to be able to demand or issue complaints. And so you're starting to see some problems around this. The other issue is that it's much more costly. The budget allocated for the payment of the cash transfers through private providers is nearly double what is allocated for public provisioning by unionized public servants who have all of the benefits of Social Security themselves. And in fact, the contracts with service providers are pending because they're asking well and above that rate. And finally, the state in Mozambique has struggled historically to regulate private providers, particularly where advanced digital technologies are required. And meanwhile, the payment of other grants have been delayed. So I think that, just to highlight, there's a lot of fanfare about the possibilities of digital technologies, that they can easily and quickly and cheaply transfer cash transfers or cash from government coffers or international development agencies to beneficiaries. And we're starting to see these initiatives, with fancy names like G2PX, which is a partnership between the World Bank and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And it's sort of a recycling of old wine in new bottles, right? They could aim to create a new payment ecosystem where customers have the freedom to choose between a wide array of competing private providers and accounts. There's a sort of visioning that states can become future ready by fast tracking regulations and incentivizing the entry of private mobile providers and e-money operators. But of course, all subsidized using taxpayer money. So although digital technologies can certainly play a progressive role in the expansion of redistributive schemes, it's important to recognize that they are not neutral, that this is a space of struggle between labor, capital, and the state. And I say labor in the widest definition of the word. And it can either, be a progressive way of expanding social or redistribution, or it can drive forth a politics of austerity by increasing the costs of cash transfers through subsidies to capital, by decentering the role of state administration and in fact legitimizing the casualization of workers, by accelerating what Lavinas has called the collateralization of the poor, by trapping recipients in these relations of credit and debt and subverting the role of social welfare. So it's important, and here I go back into an article by Prof. Jayati Ghosh, and I'm so excited to be sharing this panel with her. It's important not to abstract from the broader processes of accumulation, right? What are the relationships between cash transfers and other forms of redistribution, other forms of public services, to that relationship with production? What are the kind of class dynamics that are emerging in this process? So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ruth.
Okay. Oh yeah, great.
Perfect.
So I'm going to be telling the story of the special COVID grant that was introduced as part of the social assistance emergency measures, and focusing in a way on some of the elements of the backstory and of the challenges in actually operationalizing a grant of this kind. I think the story begins from my perspective, at least. I was tasked with looking at how we could ensure that the relief that was going to the small enterprise sector could reach the informal sector as well. And it was very quickly clear that in fact that was going to be extremely difficult to achieve, and that what might be needed in order to support the informal sector was a special COVID grant. The idea was mooted with the team in the presidency that I was working with, and Rudy Dix encouraged me to get the idea out there through an article which happened, which started a discussion around what a special COVID grant could look like. The article went out on the 22nd of March. The 23rd of March, we convened the first advisory group of a range of people, academics, practitioners, policymakers, to look at what this might entail. It included the team from Saldru that became referred to as the Young Turks, that convened by Murray Leibrand to look at the data and support us in that regard. So the starting point was how to target households affected by the loss of informal sector income. And the more we looked at it, the more it became clear that in our context, it was really difficult. In fact, it was just not possible. So we have statistical data, but we just don't have administrative data on the informal sector. We can't find them. We know where they are geospatially. We know statistically what the sector looks like, but we don't have their IDs. We don't have their addresses. We don't know which households they're in. Informal is informal. Even in terms of targeting per household, which was an approach that many different interlocutors encouraged. We don't have a register of households, and household composition is changing rapidly. There are also incentive issues in targeting households, as we've seen, for example, with the RDP housing context, where it has encouraged decomposition of households. So as we looked at it, and as it got more and more complicated, the question became, can't we use this opportunity to address the wider social protection gap in our context and, in a sense, catch the informal sector in the net in that process? And that's what we started to look at. When we looked at the data, what became quickly clear was that the quickest, easiest, and biggest poverty impact would be from increasing the child support grant. This, however, reproduces the existing social protection gap. It means a whole lot of people would still fall through the cracks. For those not familiar with the South African social policy setup, we have a strong component of child support grants based on the child as beneficiary, but channeled through an adult. And we have the old age pension and we have disability grants, but we have a huge gap in the sense that we have significantly high unemployment. But unless unemployed people have prior work experience and have contributed to the unemployment insurance fund, they get no form of coverage. The child support grant has a strong gender bias towards women as caregivers. And so the people mostly falling through the cracks, there are women falling through the cracks, but many young men in particular fall through the cracks of our social protection system. So we looked at how we might look at a complementary approach. Firstly, supporting an increase to the child support grant, again, as quickest, easiest, with strong poverty impacts, but how we might complement that with an additional special COVID grant. So we put a proposal in 28th of March. The presidency put a proposal into the emergency processes underway in government to propose the increase to the child support grant to happen as soon as possible, while we continued to develop proposals for a special COVID grant. If you look at the graphs here, what you see is that assuming a loss of 75% informal income from the crisis, poverty rates significantly increase in terms of the food poverty line. But if we increased to the child support grant at the levels indicated below, as well as a special COVID grant, we could actually bring poverty rates below the levels pre-lockdown. If we assumed a starker situation, which in fact is closer to the reality, which includes loss of formal income as well as the loss of the school feeding scheme, we can at least through those two mechanisms get back to the situation before the crisis began. So when we looked at the data and we looked at who would qualify for a special COVID grant, if we used the certain criteria of exclusion, so the target was, the assumption was that this child support grant would increase. And if we included those on UIF, those paying tax because they're employed, NSFAS, other grants, what we found is a universe of 15 million people who would nevertheless qualify for a special COVID grant. That's more than the total number of recipients of the old age pension and the child support grant put together, as well as the other grants, the disability grant. It was very quickly very clear that there was no fiscal appetite and very little political appetite for increasing the range of grants to this scale. And so the discussion moved quite quickly to how can we get these numbers down? How can we target the poor better in order to get this grant across the line? I mean, the data are pretty fascinating and pretty stark. You realize that right up to decile 7, people on an individual basis, the household income per capita is below the level of the minimum wage. It's just a reminder of our levels of poverty and actually our levels of inequality. But the bottom line here is that 10 million people within up to decile 7 per capita are still below the level of the minimum wage. But what was somewhat bizarre and unexpected, to be honest, was that 5 million people in the top 3 deciles would be eligible for the grant if we used those criteria. And the critical issue became how to exclude them. Yes, we were not arguing for a universal grant in this context, because our belief was that the political economy context meant we had to get the numbers down in order to focus on the poor. And there was no suggestion of being able to claw this back through the tax system at the time. So the question became, how do we exclude the top deciles? One of the issues was, can we use an income threshold? We engaged with the banks, with BASA and the Banking Council, and they confirmed, yes, we could impose an income threshold. We could, for example, use the minimum wage as the income threshold, because people receiving the minimum wage would be likely to be banked. The unbanked were likely to be in our target group anyway, so we weren't too worried about that. But people earning at and above the minimum wage were likely to be banked, and one could use some form of income threshold as part of the argument that one would be targeting the poorest. So the policy rationale we felt was clear. The targeting was getting clearer. But the issue then shifted to the question, not whether we should do a grant, but whether we could do a grant. How could a grant even be implemented? How could people be enrolled? With SASSA offices closed, the call center was overwhelmed. It had only managed to process 10,000 calls at the start of the crisis. How could we do this without queues? How would people be vetted? How would they be paid without queues at ATMs? How would we pay the unbanked? For the child support grant, for example, the banks confirmed that it took them a full year to upload people into the banking system when that transition happened. How on earth would we do this in the timeframes required? Into the Special Payments Task Team under the leadership of the Reserve Bank and the Payments Association of South Africa. They came to the party big time. This process, we were assisted by Kathy Nicolau, who assisted in convening this group. Tim Masalela from the Reserve Bank chaired it, and there was a team from the Payments Association of South Africa. And what was interesting about the context was that because of the crisis and the suspension of elements of the Competitions Act, the banking community could come together and share notes on what was possible. And what they did for us was do a full universe of options of how one could actually roll out a grant of this kind. The evaluation criteria they utilized are reflected on the left. It must support the banked and the unbanked, be simple and convenient, easy access to funds, proven and reliable, safe and secure, and rapid time to market. They looked at the various steps in the grant-making process. So the first step is onboarding, which requires registration, verification, and approval. And this is a serious process. If you're going to register people for a grant of this kind, you have to anticipate that there will be attempts at scamming, at phishing, at ghost applicants. We're seeing this right now with what's happened with UIF. The next component is the disbursement and payout process. And these are the questions that had to be addressed. And then auditability. It will not surprise some of you that the very week that this grant was announced, the Auditor General announced that he would be auditing it. So this is also a crucial part of the process. What the task team did was work out how all these different elements of the process could be put in place in a 30 to 60-day time window, with all of the options available under each component. What was important here was firstly that all these different elements involved innovation. And although the technology is readily available, the technology had not been utilized by SASSA until this point. So yes, it could be done, but it required levels of innovation at every step of the way. So the bottom line was, it is technically feasible. It also created the opportunity for previously unimaginable efficiencies as well as security. And this became a critical part of selling the grant, if you like. Meanwhile, from a political economy perspective, things were certainly hotting up. Weeks went by, hunger was rising. The proposal that the presidency had put on the table appeared to have fallen off the table. We had assumed that increasing the child support grant was a no-brainer and could happen quickly while we were putting the options for an additional grant in place. But that hadn't happened. In terms of the smoke puffs emanating from the corridors of the state, the messages were, there is no fiscal space. Then we started to hear that there was going to be an increase to the old age pension, which didn't seem to make a lot of sense and wasn't supported by the evidence. And we were repeatedly hearing that there may be the option to increase the child support grant, but the special COVID grant was dead in the water. We even started signaling defeat to the special task team, because this was a group of about 20 people from the banking sector, from fintech sectors, from the Reserve Bank. They were actually working day and night on trying to set up systems that could operationalize such a grant and could support such a grant. And we were scared that we were just wasting their time if the political economy context was actually as bleak as we were being told. To be fair, people in Treasury were also working day and night, looking at different options and different costing models. And then, just as we were, in a sense, in the depths of despair about the likelihood of this actually happening, in 48 hours, it all changed. I think what's important in this context is also to recognize that good policy ideas are really important, but unless they're champions within the system, they are likely to fall off the table. And we did have champions in the system, and many people on this call will know Rudy, and Rudy was relentless in pursuing these grants. Also derived from smoke puffs, my understanding is that the president was also pretty committed to ensuring that these grants happened and that the stimulus package happened. So in the end, there was an announcement. It was later than had been hoped. There were many elements of the announcement that were critiqued. However, the child support grant was increased. All grants, other grants were topped up, and somewhat to our amazement, a special COVID grant was also introduced at 350 Rand per person per month for 6 months for those receiving no support. Yes, 350 a month is a very small amount. It excludes those who are employed, receiving UIF or other social grants. In the process of implementation, SASSA then added the clause that it's only for people with no income. Now, this becomes a very difficult thing to implement. It's one thing to set a threshold at the minimum wage level when you know that that means most of the people you're setting the threshold for are banked. But setting the regulation that it's only for people with no income introduced new challenges. So suddenly we were thrust into the transition from theory to practice. To be fair, it's not as if SASSA had nothing on their plate at the time. Everybody will know that they were dealing with problems of queues, problems of food parcels, systems that weren't working, call centers that couldn't cope with the stress. And on top of this, they now had to roll out a brand new grant. SASSA and DSD had been part of the consultation process from the very first meeting, but they had their hands full, and I don't think they had a great deal of confidence that these grants would actually get approved. So I think it probably came as a rather horrible shock for them when these were announced, and suddenly they were tasked with rolling out this new grant at scale in a very short time frame. Now, part of the logic of the grant design, a critical part of getting the grant across the line was persuading decision makers in government that it could be done, that it was practical. And a key part of that was the idea, in theory, that we could target without physical means testing by using data and joining up data. By joining up data to the Home Affairs data and excluding all those on UIF, PAYE, receiving social grants, and so on. There's a small problem. The data had never been joined up before. Now we were faced with a reality. These data sets sit in different departments. They sit under different mandates and different regulatory frameworks in different data systems that aren't always compatible. Suddenly, SASSA had been given a 3-week time frame to roll this grant out at scale. Step one was to join up the data in order to get a net file of who was eligible. Who within the state could do this in the timeframes? SARS has the best data capabilities, and they stepped up to the plate and said, yes, they could, and they did. They joined up the data. It's never been done before. It required huge logistics internally. Once again, the PMO and Rudy and his team, supported by Saul Musker, went from department to department. It required signatures from DGs, it required approvals from IT, it required even transferring the data was a huge logistical exercise. Home Affairs data, for example, is far too much of it to transfer electronically. It had to move under armored guard. These were the logistical challenges just of joining up the data. There certainly have been challenges in the implementation process, but let me say that that initial 3-week deadline was straight up unfair. Even in the proposals for the special grant, we had said it would take at minimum 6 weeks to roll out a grant of this scale, given the systems issues that had to be addressed. But SASSA was given 3 weeks to do so and took a lot of flack for failing to meet that deadline. Yes, there have been a lot of problems. However, for the first time, an app has been used for registration, and the scale of applications indicates that that has been an accessible mechanism for the application process. The joined up data does now exist. It's never happened before, and it's yielding all kinds of interesting insights and opportunities, and it did create a net file of eligible applicants. Payments do include mobile money transfers, and while the task team's recommended payment system was not in the end used by SASSA, it has opened innovation in terms of government-to-person payment options. And right now, if my figures are correct, about 5 million people are currently receiving the grant. The big question, so for all its flaws, the special COVID grant is the first time South Africa has had a mechanism to close a key social protection gap. Yes, it's too little, and for many, it's certainly late. The counterfactual, however, might well be no grant at all. If we lose this moment, how long will it take to get a foot back in that door? The grant is currently scheduled to end at the end of October. If an extension is not included in the adjustment budget in October, the grant will end. That's how the rules work. It won't be possible to change that retrospectively. The time to address this is before the budget is finalized, not afterwards, when it's too late for tears. If we can sustain and extend this grant, it lays the basis for social policy reforms that can close the social protection gap once and for all. If we let it drop through the cracks, that opportunity may just be lost, and we may just find ourselves back at square one. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you also to Ruth for, in both your presentations, shining a light on the political economy that shapes the social policy choices that have been made both in Mozambique and South Africa. Jayati, I know you don't have a presentation. You're free to speak as you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Those were two absolutely brilliant presentations, and I'm really grateful to have had a chance to hear this wonderful, very analytical approach to the nitty-gritty of social protection in Mozambique and South Africa. It was fascinating. And I think they really helped me to to frame what I'm going to talk about, because what I want to do is do a slightly more general thing with some examples from India about the role of social protection in a period like this. And I'm beginning with two, what I would say are axiomatic kinds of positions. One is, of course, the late Tandikam Kandavire used to say this all the time, and of course he had a wonderful book about it as well. Social policy is development policy. It is not just about being nice to people or being inclusive or about welfare. It is really about the process of development in many, many ways. And I'm going to add to that by saying social policy, especially now, and social protection in particular, is also counter-cyclical macroeconomic policy. So it's not just about reducing inequality, increasing access, improving inclusion, and so on and so forth. It's not just about easing the cogs for the development wheels to keep turning, but it is also very specifically a macroeconomic policy with a very clear macroeconomic role in terms of counteracting a downslide, preventing further recession, and enabling a recovery of demand, and therefore of the economy and of employment. And I'm going to try and come back to that issue later, but let's just begin by considering that, especially right now in COVID, in the period of the pandemic, it has become evident to us that there are really three kinds of social protection that we would need to consider. The first are existing social protection schemes, which are part of, let us say, that country's social protection floor: health benefits, child support that Kate mentioned, food access. In India, we have a very extensive public distribution system of basic food grain and so on. And these are programs that then could be expanded during a pandemic or during a lockdown or during the kinds of extraordinary circumstances that we're undergoing today. The second are what are known as automatic stabilizers, unemployment benefits, for example, that kick in during downswings, that actually become much more likely to happen, and they exist, but they're much more likely to face extreme pressure or have a lot more demand during these periods. And of course, in the developed world, this is the one that has been seen as the most marked. The increase in unemployment applications and unemployment assistance applications is seen as a marker of the state of distress in the economy and so on. And the third is the new projects that are created, the new programs that have been created in the current crisis, and of course these are the much more difficult, because they also have to create a new infrastructure, somewhat in the way that Kate was mentioning. But it's extraordinary that South Africa managed to actually create that infrastructure in such a short time. But several countries have also attempted this, actually bring in entirely new programs to deal specifically with the pandemic, because the pandemic has raised very, very specific concerns. I think we need to look at these broadly in terms of a number of things. First of all, are they effective? What is their significance in ensuring the basic needs? What do they actually protect in terms of the social protection floor? And that in turn means looking at the kinds of things that both Kate and Ruth mentioned. Do they have the required coverage? Are they covering the people whom we want to cover? Are they excluding or some who should be included? Are they including some who shouldn't be included, and so on and so forth? Do they address the actual needs? Are they sufficient in quantity? You can have a pension. I mean, in India, there is officially a government pension for the elderly, but it is targeted to those who are defined as poor. And the amount is 500 rupees, which is so pathetic that it's about 80 US cents. It's less than $1 US. Okay, so it's such a small and pathetic amount that it doesn't really mean very much. So certainly we need to look at those. But I would argue that we also have to look at the macro role. In other words, what is the role that this is playing in terms of its counter-cyclical possibilities? Does it actually generate a capacity of the economy to stem the rot, to stop a downslide, to prevent further contraction in economic activity, and to create the conditions for an economic recovery? And that depends, of course, on the total level of spending, precisely the thing that most finance ministries hate, because they're all out to reduce the total spending on all of these things, even in this period, as much as possible. It depends on the fiscal multipliers involved in that type of spending. Does it generate much more spending, which would then lead to a greater revival of economic activity faster? And does it bring out supply constraints? Are there specific issues in supply which would prevent this from actually playing that positive macroeconomic role? In that context, I want to make a couple of general points, but with reference to the Indian case. So one of them has to do with the whole issue of targeting versus universal. Of course, pretty much everywhere now there is a tendency to targeting, for the obvious reason that universal is expensive. But we also know that targeting inevitably generates those type 1 and type 2 errors. The type 1 error being the unjustified exclusion, and the type 2 error being the unwarranted inclusion. So it's always the case, and especially when you're handing out things which are seen to be desirable in any way, local power equations, local access, all determine who gets registered, who becomes a beneficiary. And a lot of the time that means the exclusion of those who are deserving. and the inclusion of, let's say, less deserving. And we also find, certainly in India, that has been the case, that the most marginal groups, whether it is by caste, or it is by location, or it is by degree of education, or it is by gender, women tend to be much more badly affected, or it is ethnic group, in general, the most marginal groups tend to be more excluded. So there is a problem with having targeting, but of course we also know that not doing targeting tends to mean that you are spreading out a certain amount of money over a much larger pool, and therefore it's less likely to have much impact. You end up with the 500 rupee per month pension, for example, that I had mentioned earlier, which, by the way, incidentally is also targeted, but never mind about that. So how do we do this? I would argue that despite these concerns, there's a really strong case to be made for universalizing. And of course, the universal is something that some countries are already familiar with. Child grants, for example, right? Broadly universal in most of the countries where they are provided, with very, very minimal exclusion categories. So that, for example, in India, we have been arguing that we have to have a universal pension, only excluding those who clearly get pensions from elsewhere, everybody else included. You don't have to show an income certificate. You don't have to show that you're poor. You don't have to have somebody come and inspect your house to decide, or, you know, it doesn't matter if you have some other earning family member and so on. Anyone who doesn't get a pension from any other source should be eligible for a universal pension, is what we have been arguing, and it should be half of the minimum wage. Again, it's a distant pipe dream in India, but it is certainly a demand that has been raised. But there are two other areas where, in fact, it's a very, where India has existing social protection. And I don't know whether you would call an employment program social protection. In many ways, it's not, because it's very hard and difficult physical work. But let's look first at the food program. We have in India a very large system of public procurement and distribution of essential food grains. In some states, they have actually added to that by including, let's say, also other pulses, cooking oil, salt, sugar, etc. But the basic national program consists of wheat, rice, and some minimal other grains. Now, this was actually legalized in 2013 under the National Food Security Act. It was a rights-based legislation that basically said everybody has the right to a minimal amount of food. But once again, it created a targeting. Under that target, at the time, 67% of the population was supposed to be included. Of course, the trouble is that when you do this targeting, you then have to go around and identify the beneficiaries. So there was a social and economic survey done, which went around identifying households as deserving. A lot get kept out of the net, sometimes because they were physically very distant and in extremely backward locations, sometimes because they didn't have sometimes because they were homeless and you basically went to houses to survey. Sometimes because because families evolved over time and the household was no longer the same household, but then the new household hadn't been classified as being eligible. So as a result of that, since the program was started, it's been estimated that around 120 million people, even out of the so-called deserving beneficiaries, are excluded. But increasingly today, we are getting reports of people who are extremely poor, extremely underprivileged, extremely deprived, who do not have this ration card, this wonderful thing that would allow you access to the public distribution system, and who often are on the verge of starvation. A lot of this has been compounded by the use of a biometric identity, the Aadhaar card as it is known, which is often touted as this wonderful technological solution to the whole problem of provision. Now, the use of the Aadhaar card is ultimately based on the idea that citizens are criminals. that give them a chance and they will try and cheat the system or game it, or access something which they don't deserve, and so on. The Aadhaar card will prove your identity, will prevent you from getting anything twice, will prevent you from accessing something that you don't deserve and you're not entitled to, and so on. It's been found, of course, that this biometric identification, no surprises, is very hard to establish with any degree of surety in very large populations. Around 12% of the time, the biometrics will not match. And guess whom it doesn't match for? It doesn't match mostly for those who engage in manual work, which turns out to be the poorest parts of the population. And so we have very large denial of rights and entitlements because of biometric mismatch. It's also been found that the biometrics doesn't stop people from siphoning off, because there are all kinds of ways of entering the system and entering Aadhaar numbers through the intermediaries who can then siphon off, and the leakages have persisted despite. It just means that the ultimate beneficiaries are denied. Now, the basic problem, I would argue, with the biometric scheme is that it has added to an exclusion which already existed in the fact of the targeting. There have been studies done that if we didn't have a targeted scheme, if we actually said, okay, we will provide this to anybody who wants at the given prices for the ration shops, up to a certain amount per household, you would have approximately 80%, maybe 85% of the population availing of it. But it would actually enable those who were genuinely needy and genuinely deserving to access it without having to show various things which currently they are unable to show. In other words, the exclusionary aspects of this particular system would disappear. And it is very likely that those who are among the middle class and the wealthy would in any case not actually take advantage of that system. The existing program that has been, in fact, possibly the only and major lifesaver in the current crisis in India is the MNREGA, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. This is an employment program that was started in 2006, well, 2005 actually, which effectively offers 100 days of employment for every rural household at the declared national wage, which is different from the minimum wage. That's another issue. We won't go into that, but there is a declared national wage for this particular program. This is a program that has been through many ups and downs. It's got lots of regional diversity. Different state governments have implemented it in different ways. But it is effectively the only real automatic stabilizer we have, which is to say, in periods of major downswing, there is a significant increase in demand for this for work under the Rural Employment Guarantee. And certainly immediately after the global crisis in 2008, we saw this big increase in demand. We are seeing another huge increase in demand today because of the collapse of all other employment and livelihood possibilities. Of course, it's much more difficult because all of these works have to be done with physical distancing norms and all of that. But nonetheless, there is a huge increase in demand for work under this scheme. The problem with this is that there is simply not enough allocation being made in both of these to ensure that it meets all of the other conditions I mentioned earlier: coverage, needs, sufficient quantity, but also that it plays a macroeconomic role. In other words, what has happened is that despite the fact that these schemes exist, the programs exist and could be expanded without major administrative hurdles, because the infrastructure already exists, the processes already exist, the bureaucratic logistics, if you like, already exist. Despite that, the amounts being made available, even for these minimal social protection schemes, have been so miserly, so small, that they have really not been able to stem the economic downslide. So the total fiscal spending that was declared on these schemes and on everything else in terms of the recovery, the actual new spending that was declared by the government, was only about 1.2% of GDP, which is absolutely nothing given the scale of the problem, as I'm sure all of you realize. And it's also particularly shocking because 95% of our workers are actually informal. They have no legal or social protection. And so when you have a very brutal lockdown, as we had, the most draconian lockdown in the world with 4 hours notice, people are thrown out of livelihoods, people are denied wages for an extended period of 2 months, 3 months, with absolutely nothing else to save them. So we had a massive increase in extreme destitution. We've had the horrendous examples of migrants who have been trudging hundreds of kilometers back to their homes because they have run out of money and are facing starvation in the urban areas. We've had all kinds of humanitarian tragedies unfolding. But what is more to the point is that all of this has then been accompanied by an economic collapse, which, as we now know, is the most severe of all the major countries. So here's where I come back to the original point, that you see the inadequacy of the social protection has been a major reason for the bigger economic decline in India than any other country. And it's not just among G20, even in South Asia, we have the biggest decline because we have the worst, most extreme lockdown with the least social protection. I would argue that this is a time when we have to be absolutely much more ambitious in terms of not necessarily reversing, but using these existing schemes to dramatically expand them, make them universal, and focus particularly on employment programs because they are self-selecting. I think it was mentioned earlier, Ruth talked about it. I'm not a big fan of cash transfers in general, other than child support, pension, and disability. I think those, it's a given. There's no question about those. But I'm not a big fan of cash transfers otherwise in general. I generally prefer employment programs for many reasons, but one obvious reason is because they're self-selecting. People who will come and work at the minimum wage are people who need that work. But also working provides a dignity and prevents a kind of sense that, there are people who are just sitting around and getting cash for nothing and so on. I think what has to happen is that we need a much more imaginative approach to permissible work, including not just, greening of infrastructure and amenities, but a lot more on care work, especially health-related care work, of which we massively underprovide in our societies. Repair and maintenance of public areas, water management, administrative assistance for doing all of the kinds of things that, for example, Kate had mentioned, who's going to man all of those offices where people come to register, who's going to pick up the phones, who's going to make sure that deliveries are reached, and etc. I think all of these can be done with physical distancing norms. And they would generate what Hyman Minsky, who was a big advocate of employment programs, called a bubble-up approach to economic growth. I think I've already gone on too long, so I better stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jayati. That was a fascinating presentation. Thank you very, very much. I think we're running out of time, so I'm going to move to the Q&A and give participants an opportunity to engage with all three speakers. I'm going to take one set of questions and group them, which were directed at you, Kate. And people were thinking through your presentation and asking maybe if you could unpack a few issues, being one, Ivan asks whether you considered the possibility of uneven take-up of the special grant in different places. He refers to the NIDS data and he's struck by the relatively low receipt of the grant in informal urban settlements, despite the obvious needs. And he says, I suppose part of the explanation could be the number of foreign nationals in these areas. And many other questions were asking you just perhaps to talk through the beneficiaries of the special grant, anything you could share with the participants.
Yes, I suspect there are people on this call who know the answers to this better than I do. But I think a lot of the analytical work still has to be done. Who did get the grant? Who didn't get the grant? How well did the eligibility systems work? I mean, I think, if I can say so, I think the mechanism of using data to create the net file of eligible people is a very simple mechanism that then leaves a huge pool of people who are not getting any form of support. And so that's a fairly easy thing to automate, if you like. You do then need an appeals process, and that is in place, and we've got to look at how well that has worked and see who was excluded. I think for me, what has made targeting particularly difficult was the decision to make a criterion that you were only eligible if you had no income. I mean, that means even if a family member is transferring you money for data, you don't qualify. That doesn't seem to be fair, and it doesn't seem to me also to be easy to manage and adjudicate. So I think that's a key area that certainly would have brought the numbers of eligible people down from what we had anticipated. If, for example, you'd used the minimum wage or even the upper bound poverty level or even the food poverty line, all of those would be above that very absolute no income criterion. In terms of who's benefited, there has been some complaint, if you like, that more men have benefited from the special grant. But I do think one's got to bear in mind that the child support grant reaches a lot of women, and that as part of the crisis, for the very first time, a grant to caregivers was included. Now, there's all kinds of debate about how the child support grant increase was structured, but civil society has for a long time demanded that the grant should not just be for the child, but should include a grant for caregivers. So in our current COVID context, caregivers are getting a caregiver grant as well. You know, there was debate about making the special grant just for women. We did a focus group and a consultation with people involved in gender-based violence, and they came back strongly saying, please don't do that. That one of the critical reasons for gender-based violence is disputes over money, and that our current system, for all that it's good, that it prioritizes, it has a strong gender bias towards women, there are social consequences to the complete exclusion of men, unemployed men, from social support. So I think that's an important social policy issue to be exploring and looking at. What have been the impacts of, for the first time, including unemployed men without UIF in a form of social support? It's not just men that are getting it, but there is a disproportionality there. For the rest of the spread, I think time will tell. I'm not clear enough on what the outcomes of the data are yet. We're really glad that there is the series of NIDS cram data that will be happening over this exact period. So we will be able to look as the grant ticks up, where it's reaching, who it's reaching, and why it's reaching those people. I'll leave it there.
And just before you go, one more question would be from Cephas, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. How has the CWP been impacted during the pandemic?
CWP went into lockdown. They weren't working. To be honest, I thought they should have been used to assist communities with social distancing and the food parcel distribution and all of that, but that didn't happen. Further than that, I can't actually say. They were paid throughout, as far as I know. But to be honest, I'm not really clear, beyond that, how it's been impacted.
All right. Thank you, Kate. We have about 3 more minutes for questions from the floor. I don't see any hands raised. You're welcome to raise your hands at this point of the session. And in the meantime, I will ask a few questions that I've seen pop up. Jayati, there's a question for you from Guy Harris, which speaks to his experience. I'm assuming it's a gentleman. Apologies if I'm incorrect. his experience in Kolkata, Mumbai, and Delhi. He says Mumbai and Delhi more hopeful for India despite higher poverty levels than in South Africa due to your strength of family and faith systems rather than a fanatical religion. In India and South Africa were decimated by the migratory labor system. Is it still the strength? And then Suraj, I do note your hand is up. I'll come to you next.
Well, you know, in India, we're going through a pretty bad time, both politically and economically. And unfortunately, I would not call what's happening in India any expression of faith. It's an expression of crude use of religion for political means and as a divisive force to distract from failures in governance. So no, I'm not optimistic that, you know, systems of faith and family are going to pull India out of this mess. In fact, I feel that the pandemic has kind of shone an X-ray on all of the worst elements of Indian society, including, you know, not just the terrible casteist approach of the ruling and middle classes, but also very, very deep and unjustified exclusions that are very much part of our society and which are deeply distressing. So I don't think that this has brought us, has exposed anything nice about India at the moment, unfortunately.
All right. Thank you, Jayati. I want to give Ruth an opportunity to respond to a question. Ruth, what lessons should Mozambique learn from South Africa's forms of payment? And then I'll take Suraj as the last question for today.
Thanks very much for the question. So I think that it's really important to recognize the specificity of countries and that there's not one single blueprint. So for instance, if you take Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe has a very expansive mobile money network. Mozambique does not. So I think it's important when social policies are being rolled out to really consider, well, how many people are actually digitally connected, have access to cell phones, are literate, are able to have trust in the government. So some of the early reports during registration was that there's already some ambivalence in relation to the state or in terms of trust in the state. And thus there was ambivalence in registering for electronic payments that one could not touch, that were on top of it going to be administered by an intermediary who was also selling funeral insurance, right? So I think, you know, it's gonna really vary from place to place. But some of the issues that Kate raised around data, the ability to have institutions that can actually bring together databases, that has been a major issue in Mozambique. A second is the administrative capacity at all levels. South Africa had the benefit of having gone through this whole insourcing process of CPS. And despite all of the difficulties, having some kind of administrative structure in place as well. But yeah, I think it is very specific.
Thank you, Ruth. Suraj?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Jayati, Kate. Yeah.
Great to hear you, Suraj. Yeah.
Thanks. It's good to see you. Mine is more comment, and I'm making it because I didn't see any other hands up. So there was a space for it. And it's a response to this. And maybe before that, I should thank Kate and other people for their hard work during this time and making sure that the money that did get through got through and the work was done. But I mean, drawing on what Kate was saying and Jayati, I mean, the first thing is that there's this assumption that there isn't fiscal space, right? People point to debt to GDP or increasing GDP or drop in revenues, and then they assume that, and especially in government, you go to a government department and say, why aren't you guys doing this? They say Treasury will never agree to it because there's no fiscal space. And we need to start changing that discourse. We need to also start changing this view that, you know, that you actually work out fiscal space by looking at revenue and expenditure. And to start pointing out that government expenditure is really important for aggregate demand in the economy, that what's seen as government consumption is often this kind of money, spending on people to secure their futures and investing in communities and households. So, so there's a real, for me, a lot of the problem is the kind of discourse, and a discourse that Treasury often reinforces. And if you look at the way that the budget is written as a document, and not only in South Africa, everywhere else, it's actually structured in terms of revenue, expenditure, and we as we go now into the medium-term budget discussion, we're going to be developing a fiscal framework, and we're going to be told that we have to achieve a surplus by 23-24. I should stop here and say that I'm saying this in my personal capacity and not as a deputy director in the Parliamentary Budget Office, but I mean and I would urge people in civil society. I mean, there's been a really good response to budgets and things within Parliament in the public processes, but I would urge more and more people in civil society to go in and to challenge not only the numbers, but also the way in which the people talk about the numbers and what it means, and to actually see investment in people as investment in our futures and capital expenditure, not consumption. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Suraj.
Could I make one comment? Is there time to have a quick 1 minute, or are we done?
1 minute.
Yeah, so, I just want to reaffirm what Siraj said, especially during a pandemic and a decline like this. Spending less will mean you will end up with a larger fiscal deficit. The less you spend, the less multiplier, the worse the decline, the less the tax revenues, you will end up actually being worse. So the Treasury needs to be told that spending less now is macroeconomically stupid.
Thanks, Jayati. We've run out of time, but thank you to all three presenters. Fascinating presentations, and thank you for your time. I know everyone is suffering from brain COVID fatigue, so thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for being patient with us as we've run over time, and thank you for engaging. We do have one more Apport seminar session tomorrow with 3 speakers, Basani Boloi, Gabriel Palmer, and Niva Machetla, on income inequality. So please do join us if you've got some time. It's at 3:30 tomorrow. Other than that, thank you again for everyone's attention. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Baba.
Thanks. Bye.